All right, next up, JavaScript functions. The last of the big topics in JavaScript we have remaining, at least the big fundamental topics. So there are lots of other things we need to cover, smaller pieces of JavaScript, more advanced things, but functions are right up there with stuff like arrays and conditionals and variables. We will use functions all the time from here on out. So what are they? Why don't we start there? Functions are just reusable chunks of code that we've wrapped up and given a name so that I can use them at any point. So these are super useful for reducing the duplication in our code and just making our code easier to look at, or not just to look at, but easier to understand. And we use them a lot. I'm talking a lot, all the time. Every single thing, like I've mentioned from here on out, you're bound to, almost guaranteed to use functions in your code. So here's a situation where we would benefit from a function. We've seen this a lot, right? Generating a random integer. Unfortunately, in JavaScript, we get math.random. That gives us a decimal from 0 to 1. So then we usually multiply it, and then we often floor it to get an integer, and we shift it. In this case, I'm trying to get a die roll from 1 to 6. So let's say, I save that to a variable, die1. That's not bad. I need to run this code, right? I don't have an option. That's it. This gives me a random number from 1 to 6, hopefully. Let's take a look. Die1 is 1. I'm refreshing. Now it's 5. Now it's 6. Okay. But let's say I'm making a game where I need 6 random dice. So I don't need it just once, but I actually need 6 more of these. Well, I would have to write this line every single time, right? And this isn't that bad. This is a pretty short line of code compared to some of the things that we'll encounter, but it's a simple example. So then I would need, die 2, die 3, die 4, die 5, and die 6. And this will work, or it should work. Let's take a look. Let's look at die 1. We got 4, die 2 is 6, and so on. All right, so that's working. But it would be much nicer, in my opinion, if we could do something just like, instead of having to do all of that, just roll die. And then duplicate that a bunch of times. Anytime I needed a new number from 1 to 6, I could just call roll die, assume that these were 2 and 3 and so on. So we'll be able to do that shortly once we learn how to write functions and we talk about return values. But there's actually another level that we could take this to. If roll die gives us a random number from 1 to 6, maybe there's another part in our game where we use, let's say this is like a Dungeons and Dragons sort of clone, or I don't know if you could clone that, but let's say it's a role-playing game where you actually have like a 12-sided die at some point, and you have some 6-sided dice, and I don't really, it's been a long time since I played D&D, but whatever, there's different sizes of the dice that you use. So we could even make this a fancier roll die that actually is going to accept a number of sides. So here we could roll a 20-sided die, and this is rolling a 6-sided die. And this could be rolling another 20, and here's a 12. So we could make a function that does exactly that. It actually accepts an input. It allows us to modify its behavior. So that's our real end goal, is to make functions that are just nice, reusable chunks of code, but also write these functions in a way that they're sort of modular or reusable, where we can pass in some sort of input that will impact the output that we get out. And again, roll die is a simple function, relatively. But there are so many things that you'll see later on in the course where writing functions might save us not just 1 line at a time, but maybe 20 plus lines, or 40 or 50 or 1,000 lines for some of these nasty functions that actually call other functions, which call other functions. I'm getting ahead of myself, but we'll get there soon. But let's start with the basics, of course. In the next video, we'll tackle writing our first silly function.